everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Connecting People to Best Practice webinar all around knowledge assets. This is the last in our series of webinars, and thank you to Sue Robertson for organising and coordinating the webinars, and to my colleague Carol Giles for helping to present some of the webinars. My name's Alison Day. I'm the lead librarian at East Dorset NHS Library and Knowledge Service. And I also have a role working as a project manager for Knowledge for Healthcare, specifically coordinating some of the work around mobilising evidence and knowledge. So we asked a poll earlier. We asked, have you ever created a knowledge asset? And we had a bit of a mixed response. Some people thought they had, but a lot of people didn't really know. And I think that probably describes how I feel about knowledge assets. And then we asked, have you ever created a resource around a particular topic? And I think the majority of people answered yes to that question. So that's something that we are quite familiar with doing. So hopefully I'm going to show through the course of this presentation that actually the two are quite closely linked. So today we're going to be looking at knowledge assets. We're going to try and find a definition. I always like to start with a definition. I find that that helps me. We're going to consider why you would use a knowledge asset and when you would use a knowledge asset, and think about what the standard contents of a knowledge asset might be, what it would look like. We'll take some time to explore some case studies from the Knowledge Management Toolkit, which is located on the Knowledge for Healthcare blog, and we'll think about the steps involved in building or creating your own knowledge asset. There'll be two discussion activities which hopefully will help us to think about how we as Library and Knowledge Services staff can actually facilitate the creation of knowledge assets. The webinar will take about sort of 30 minutes or so to run through, depending again how many questions we have. And of course you're welcome to ask questions at any time using the chat facility and sending those through to Sue, who's on host too. So definition to start, thinking about what is a knowledge asset. In the picture that I found describing an asset's obviously a thing of value, often referred to in economic terms, but we're not particularly interested in the economic setting here. But we are thinking about it as being an approach to actually capturing operational knowledge or learning or know-how and providing a context to make sense of that know-how and knowledge. It provides a format and a method by which one team or person can transfer their knowledge to many teams or people at any time they desire and to any required location. So a really good example of an everyday knowledge asset is something like a recipe book. Particularly if you think about some of the famous TV chefs who've produced recipe books, the Jamie Olivers, the Nigella Lawsons, the Nigel Slaters, trying not to miss anybody out. Really, a cookbook is all about taking an expert's experience, in this case the chef or the cook, taking their information on how to prepare a meal, tips on what kind of ingredients to use and quantities, thinking about optimum tools and techniques to deliver best results, which the end user, me, can utilise when and where they desire. So it could be in my kitchen, it could be in my mum's kitchen, and that's a kind of basic knowledge asset. What most cookbooks now also do are provide hints and anecdotes and tips, and that makes them more interesting to read and use. And it might inspire me to actually have a go at a recipe that perhaps normally I wouldn't perhaps be interested in having a go at doing. But because of the anecdotes and tips, that maybe inspires me to try something new or look at something in a different way. And that's exactly the purpose of a knowledge asset. So really, if you have some learning or some know-how that you want to package and transfer and make it available to someone else at a different time or place, creating a knowledge asset is a good thing to do. And then if you're actually thinking about starting off on a new work activity, you would then want to refer to a knowledge asset so you can benefit from the knowledge of those who have completed similar tasks. This is a screenshot of the actual Knowledge Management Toolkit. Just showing you where the knowledge assets portion sort of sits, and within the toolkit, knowledge assets is considered as a connecting people to corporate knowledge activity, so best practice activity. Knowledge assets can be created at any point through the knowledge management cycle, so it can be a learning before, during or after activity, because it's where the results of all of those activities tend to sit. And I tend to sit it as a learning during tool, mainly because it's happening throughout the life cycle of knowledge management. You'll see on the left-hand side, you've got various KM activities, tools and techniques listed, knowledge assets being one. And then in the column on the right-hand side, you've got various case studies illustrating how some of these tools can be used. And if you haven't yet had an opportunity to look at the case studies, there are also some further stories connected to knowledge management listed in the toolkit in a separate section. They're really useful ways of trying to understand how we as library and knowledge services staff can try and put into practice various knowledge management tools and techniques, and show how other library and knowledge services staff have actually been able to do this to great effect in their organisations. So connecting people to corporate knowledge is about developing an organisational memory, promoting actionable knowledge tools, collating enabling shared access to directories, policy, guidance and protocols. And that's really where the knowledge asset element fits in. So we move on to our first activity for this session, and I'd like you to just think about if you were about to start out on a new piece of work. Maybe imagine a scenario where you've been asked to create a database of publications by local authors for your organisation. And I'd like you just to take a few minutes just to think about what would be the key questions that you would ask yourself before starting out on this new piece of work. So I'm going to ask you to put your answers onto the whiteboard. I'll just display that now. So here are some of the responses that we received. Has anyone done this before is one of the questions. What IT support can I get? Who would use it? IT compatibility of my database in the NHS network, really useful thing to ask and consider. Thinking about how you're going to store the knowledge or access the knowledge, who else you can work with. How much maintenance will it require? How will it be updated? Who will update it? And how does it relate to trust and departmental objectives and needs? Thinking about the deadline is also quite useful. So some really good suggestions there of questions or things you might want to consider before you embark on a new piece of work. And they match pretty much the questions that I thought you would also need to consider. Thinking about what key information do you need to complete the task. Thinking about what are the biggest issues that are facing you before you start off on something. Thinking about the processes, techniques, tools, people you need to know about. Thinking about how others got on doing this. And thinking about what will be the critical success factors that need to be in place for this to really work. So the content of a standard knowledge asset really is based around the answers to those questions, thinking about what are the most important things I need to know. And these are some of the things that you might want to include in your standard knowledge asset. You might include process maps, you might include lessons learned from previous projects or actions, templates, context-specific guidelines might be useful. You might want to include procedures that are particularly relevant or pertinent to this particular piece of work, and you may choose to include useful contacts. One could argue that most of content is actually information, and it's quite useful probably at this point to pause and consider this quotation which was found by my colleague Carol Giles, which is really looking at the difference between knowledge and information. So the realization that knowledge and information are not the same. Information is relatively easy to identify, store and transfer, but it's not the same for knowledge. So we could argue that what we've looked at in the content already for a knowledge asset is actually information. And that's something that as librarians we'll be used to packaging and sharing all the time. It's something that we manage on a regular basis. We could, for example, imagine a library as being actually a knowledge asset. Your books or your journals or your articles are all things that you organize and coordinate and collate and arrange in a specific way to make them easy for the end user to find and use. So you're actually managing that information. Same authors of this paper, Nazim and Mukherjee in Knowledge Management in Libraries, Concepts, Tools and Approaches, Move on to then describe the various categories of knowledge. They say that tacit knowledge, know-how, which is based on practice and it's acquired by personal experience, can be the most difficult kind of knowledge to share. Whereas explicit knowledge, objects-based knowledge, things that come from products or software codes, patents, rule-based, things that are policies and procedures, that's relatively easy to share because it's documented, it's already out there. And then you may also involve cultural, you might want to include cultural knowledge, things around behaviours or values. That might be useful within your knowledge asset to include things around cultural values. So we've said that to build a knowledge asset, the content of a knowledge asset must really start with the question, what are the most important things that I need to know? And we've said that it will often include a lot of very explicit information type based knowledge, so the things we've already talked about. But then to make a knowledge asset really beneficial and really helpful, you may also want to weave in know-how, and you might do that by gathering stories and case studies and quotes and insights. Inclusion of this kind of material within your knowledge asset enlivens the content. It makes it more interesting for somebody to use and actually provides further information for people. They're more likely to gain benefit from the knowledge asset and the learning within it because it's presented in that way by actually giving us personal reflections and personal experiences alongside the purely sort of informational and functional information that's also contained within the knowledge asset. So looking at the Knowledge Management Toolkit, there are a couple of case studies which describe the collation and creation of what we would really describe as knowledge assets. The first of these is the Library Book of Revalidation, which was developed in West Suffolk. This is a booklet that provides a one-stop shop, not only for revalidation resources and guides on how to complete a revalidation, but it's also got useful information about database searching, critical appraisal, and local training opportunities through the library. It has two main functions: to act as a guide and template for successful revalidation, and it acts as a useful and effective promotional tool for library services. It's a knowledge asset because it brings all of that information together. I've not looked at the Library Book of Revalidation, but it may well also contain case studies and stories and insights to help other people who are undertaking revalidation. Another example is the Armed Forces Champion resource, which has been developed in Health Education England North West. This was developed on the basis of a request whereby a range of champions who are supporting the armed forces across the Northwest area wanted a bank of resources to encourage each other to collaborate more virtually and to share resources and knowledge. Each organisation had materials they thought it would be useful to share with the network across the region. And they wanted a kind of one-stop shop where all of this could be hosted, where they could look for information and they could signpost colleagues to it. So a suite of resources was developed and presented on an internet site. Again, a knowledge asset. A third example is the Emergency Medicine Handbook app. This was developed by Royal Liverpool and Broad Green University Hospitals NHS Trust. The Library and Knowledge Service was approached to transfer what had been a paper handbook into an app format so it was readily available by all junior doctors. The handbook covers the management of common acute conditions that may be presented in inpatients or people arriving in the emergency department. It links with relevant trust policies and protocols, provides useful contact information, and also local, regional and national guidelines. A doctor described the app as being a great idea and went on to say that I've used the app when treating patients with a wide variety of illnesses to ensure their management is in keeping with the latest guidance. This handy app has links to current guidelines, useful contents and trust policies, as well as advanced life support protocols, making it an invaluable patient safety reference tool. So again, it's about taking a range of different information and pulling it together into one resource that's actually relevant and useful for a particular cohort of people, in this case junior doctors. The last example that I've taken from the blog, now I think there are other examples on the blog that you can take a look at, is actually the Obstetrics and Gynecology database, which has been hosted on an intranet at Brighton and Sussex University Hospitals NHS Trust. And the purpose of this was again to bring together local guidelines with related national guidance, local audit work and research, so there was a complete overview of the evidence in this particular area. The added advantage of doing this was to see where there were gaps in the local guidance, and that actually could then spur on research and take the research forward. So hopefully those 4 examples have given you some ideas of the kinds of things that can be kind of subject areas where knowledge assets can really help and support a community, or can actually help future people coming along and doing similar work, so they can learn from what's happened before them. We're going to think about our next activity, and like I say, hopefully the examples will have sort of given you some ideas about the kinds of knowledge assets you might be able to create for your own organisations. What I'd like you to do is just take a few minutes just to share any areas or topics where either you've already created something or where you may consider developing a knowledge asset. It may be that you've already got a subject guide for a particular range of resources on a particular topic, and maybe it would just be a small step just to add in a few more details to actually expand that and make it into a more enlivened and useful knowledge asset that can be used by people in your organisation. So I'll just pull up the second whiteboard and ask you just to contribute your ideas. So somebody noting that there seems to be an ongoing need for information and resources on mentorship and reflection and revalidation. That seems to be a very sensible area to develop and shape and develop knowledge assets around. Seems to be a need there for that information and that know-how. Things around publications and maybe a database or spreadsheet on maybe publications produced by local authors. Perhaps working with the research department, maybe even developing help for researchers so that all the information researchers need is all together in one place. Another person has mentioned, making sure that all the research that's published by trust staff is notified and included. It's maybe suggested working with the around the end-of-life care pathway and making sure that that's kept up to date. And some of the tools within a knowledge asset cross over with some of the other knowledge management tools that we've been talking about. So Helen Bingham kindly described how we keep people up to date. We're talking about things like current awareness bulletins, alerts, policy briefings and horizon scanning. And it may well be that some of that content could be added to a knowledge asset to really help people stay up to date and keep up to date. Somebody's talking about a talent database, maybe showing who to approach as a sort of a think tank there is, who to approach to help with things. So getting people in touch with people as well as people in touch with organisational knowledge. And then actually working with specific teams, so perhaps junior doctors who run the Quality Improvement Academy, or neonatal staff, perhaps the pain team and the clinical skills or simulation team, maybe pulling resources together to support them in what they're doing. Or indeed teams that are maybe not based on a main site, like the rheumatology team. So lots of ideas there of, different people you can approach in your organisations to take things forward. And I'm sure you'll all have your own examples of where you can perhaps a knowledge asset would probably bring some value to a particular team or a particular group of people. So once you've decided that you've maybe got somebody, you've maybe been approached to create a knowledge asset, or you've seen an opportunity where you can see that a knowledge asset would really bring value to a team or a group, you then need to think about how you would actually build that knowledge asset. And there are some key things that should be included. It's absolutely crucial that you get the context right. You think about the purpose of the knowledge asset, you outline the scope of the knowledge asset, and you think about the customer, the intended audience for your asset. That's the first place to begin. You then think about the capture. You think about how you're going to access and collate knowledge, particularly thinking about methods to gather knowledge that's held within people's heads, people's know-how. And the best way to gather that information is actually to do that via a dialogue, via conversation, or even an interview. And it may well be that there'll be other knowledge management tools that will be really helpful for helping you to actually gather this information. So, for example, maybe using the questions from an after-action review or a retrospect, or thinking about some of the tools in knowledge harvesting or that are mentioned in the retention and transfer of knowledge tool might be useful ways of getting stories and case studies to enliven your knowledge asset. Most of the tools and techniques that we've described in these webinars, or indeed are available on the Knowledge Management Toolkit, most of the outputs from those would eventually find themselves in a knowledge asset somewhere. So that's what you would be looking for, having used the tools and techniques, the resulting know-how that you've discovered. You'd be looking to present and package that in some way to make it usable and available for other people to access. The next step really in building your asset is to think about collation and validation. So this is maybe looking at various different sources and trying to streamline that information, synthesizing and summarizing, if you will, the key learning messages. This might be looking at lesson logs, lessons learned logs that have come from various different projects. It might be looking back at what happened and then turning those lessons and those learning points into forward-looking advice for the future. And then it's thinking about how that can be presented. So it may be presented as recommendations, or it might be framed as questions that somebody starting off on a piece of work should ask, or it may just be a simple checklist for future users to follow. The next step is then to actually validate that information to make sure that the knowledge resonates with future users. It's actually meaningful. The next step is then to develop the actual knowledge asset. And this is maybe about thinking about the format that you want your asset to take. So whether you might do it on a wiki, so there's some discussion areas, and people can self-update the knowledge asset. Or it might be an intranet page because it needs to be in a closed space. Or it might be on an open web page. Or it could be an app, as we've seen demonstrated already, or indeed a hypertext document. Or even just a printed book, as in the case of the revalidation library book. Most knowledge assets tend to be text-based, but they don't have to be, and it would be worth trying to see how you could incorporate video and pictures to make it more interactive and suitable for different learning styles. Content as an absolute minimum should include the context, the history of the project, guidance for future teams around the context of this particular area, and some supporting tools and techniques, maybe templates, maybe policies, maybe guidance, maybe clear pathways, and links to relevant documents. Also, it's really crucial that you include the contact details of people who have contributed or been involved, so that if people do need further information or further detail, they know who to go back to get that information from. The next step is then to take all of that knowledge that you've gathered and captured and think about structuring that in a way to make it as useful as possible for the reader so that it's easy to follow and understand. I think out of all of the aspects of building a knowledge asset, this is the one that we're probably most able to do and most familiar with. This is something that is kind of our bread and butter really of what we do. Then it's about publishing the asset, putting it somewhere where customers can find it. Community space is ideal, and actually a lot of knowledge assets are created as a result of working with communities of practice. That's so you're supporting a particular team or particular group. And if you wanted to know more about communities of practice, we did an earlier WebEx about communities of practice. And again, there's lots of information on the Knowledge Management Toolkit. And then it's about maintaining and embedding the asset. If it goes out of date, it's not kept fresh, it's not as useful. So it's really important to keep that knowledge up to date. It's about asking for feedback, so when people can let you know when things are no longer relevant. And it's also really useful if you can appoint a knowledge owner from the team or the area of the business that has requested the asset to be produced. They then take ownership. They are responsible for keeping it up to date. They're responsible for making sure it's used. And this could be used for future business, so everybody make sure they refer to the asset before they take on a new action or move forward, or it could be used within training programs. So within this webinar, we've considered what is a knowledge asset and why it is useful. We thought about questions to develop the contents of a knowledge asset, and we've done a little bit of looking at the theory behind the difference between information and knowledge and what the difference is between those two. We've looked at examples of knowledge assets created by library and knowledge services and considered areas where we may be able to create a knowledge asset for our own organisations. And we've also outlined the steps involved in actually building a knowledge asset, the process that you would need to work through. So I'll just see if there are any questions that have arisen about knowledge assets. And there aren't too many coming through, but so one question is around how do you know when how do you limit it, or how do you know when you've got too much? You know, it could become unwieldy or too big. And I suppose that's about going back to the context and thinking about who this is for, what's the purpose of the knowledge asset, and not sort of just collecting everything, but actually being quite sort of tailored and specific, bearing in mind what's the most important thing for somebody to know who's going to be taking on this piece of work or some similar piece of work in future. So this isn't a process of gathering everything there is to know. It's about gathering the information and the knowledge that you need to know that will help you move onwards. So I think that's quite important. So somebody else has asked about would you take information from lessons learned logs, and absolutely you would. So often with projects that are run or indeed within the health service, you'll have sort of action reviews and lessons learned from different actions or risks that have happened. Feeding that information into your knowledge asset is really crucial. And you may have this coming from several different sources. So rather than just having the logs as they stand, you may want to actually do a little bit of formatting around that to remove any duplicates and kind of consolidate that information to make it more useful for people. Okay, so there are some additional resources to help you find out more or to help you to create your own knowledge asset. We have got the knowledge asset postcard, which is it's available at the URL listed there. And this has outlined the steps and is like a quick reference card to get you started with knowledge assets. It can also be quite useful to show to somebody to sort of explain what you mean by creating a knowledge asset if you're trying to encourage somebody to think about creating a knowledge asset or you feel it might be useful for their area of business. There is also a piece of e-learning which has some useful tips in it around creating knowledge assets. And there are also the case studies which I mentioned earlier. And as I said, if you haven't had a chance to look at those, I really recommend that you have a look at those real-life examples of what librarians have been doing in this area of work, because it can sort of inspire you to have a go and realise that it is manageable because other people have actually done it. As far as the postcards go, we're actually updating that suite of resources at the moment, and we hope those to be available in the first quarter of 2018. There will be some additional postcards as well for some of the other knowledge management tools that perhaps aren't included at the moment. So, for example, there'll be a card on knowledge cafes and how to run a knowledge cafe, and there'll be a card on action learning sets and randomized coffee trials. So do look out for those when they are published. And the e-learning, we're currently working on updating the e-learning. A lot of the content there is still relevant and useful, but we'd like to make it slightly more interactive for people. And we're hoping that that should be available probably, we're aiming for June in 2018. And the idea behind that is that it will support library and knowledge services staff to use knowledge management tools and techniques, but it will also be somewhere where we can direct the wider NHS workforce so they can start to understand the value of some of these tools and techniques, maybe approaching their library and knowledge teams to help facilitate use of some of the tools, but really to encourage people to start using and sharing their knowledge much more effectively within the health service. So it just leaves me to say thank you for listening. I hope you found the content today useful. Recordings of all the webinars in this series and copies of the presentation slides can be accessed on the library Knowledge for Healthcare library blog. And if you did have any further questions or queries, I think we'd be delighted to try and answer those as best we can. And just leaves me to say thank you once again for listening. And please remember to give us some feedback as well to let us know how useful the presentations have been, or indeed if there's anything else that you would like to see included perhaps in a future round. Thank you. Goodbye.